assuming the fortification of Jerusalem were actually built during the first period of Nehemiah as a governor in Yehud, started at 445 BCE. The main question is what happened during the time period in which Artaxerxes I allowed the Judeans to build fortifications in Jerusalem. What was the reason for this change in the Persian policy? Most scholars explain the building of Jerusalem fortifications as a result of a Persian decision, reward, or even as a result of Persian interest and need. The emphasis was placed on the active role of the Achaemenids. Most scholars connected the Achaemenid permission to build the fortification of Jerusalem with the political and military developments in the region, mainly to the pressure of the Delian League on the Mediterranean coast since 476 BCE, the revolt in Egypt from winter 461 and 460 to 454 BCE, and the unrest along the coastal area and the revolt of Megabizos in 448 BCE. Most scholars drew their conclusions on this active Achaemenid policy towards Judah on the basis of the description of the Greek sources, the description of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the basic assumption regarding the strategic importance of Judah. Carefully studying these sources, I would like to doubt whether there was a real danger to the rule of Artaxerxes I over the western part of his empire because of the revolt in Egypt, the pressure of the Delian League, and the alleged revolt by Megabizos. Was there a real sense of danger felt by the Achaemenids? Was it a real period of change in the way they ruled in the Levant? The attempt to understand the segmented, literary, theological-oriented biblical descriptions that use some of the events that took place in Jerusalem in the middle of the 5th century BCE, according to the historical description of the Greek literary sources for its own purpose, without archaeological or any other evidence for the Persian acts all over the Levant, is, to say the least, a methodological problem. In any case, I can see no connection between all these events and the history of the province of Yehud. I doubt the relevance of a fortified city in the hill country to the Achaemenid military needs, and I doubt the effect of the fortification or even garrison in Jerusalem on the continued conflict between the Persians and the Egyptians or the Persians and the Greeks. I also find no military reason for the Persians to strengthen their holding along the roads in the hill country and the Negev area during this period and assume that it can be a good explanation for the social, economic, and military processes that took place at the end of the 5th and during the first half of the 4th century BCE, when the Egyptians freed themselves from the Persian yoke and preserved their independence until 343 BCE, the eve of the Persian Empire. During this time, the Achaemenids may have understood that the land of Israel, and mainly the southern part of it, became the most important border area for the empire and place of battlefield between the Persian army and many of its enemies. It may be that this period was the most important one in the history of this region since the Babylonian conquest and destruction at the beginning of the 6th century BCE. It was probably the reason for and the period during which the Achaemenids established their rule and reorganized the administration and the security along the roads along the southern part of the coastal area, the southern Shephelah, and along the Beersheba-Arad valleys. This is the date when the main administrative center in Lachish was erected. This is the period of most of the forts and administrative centers along the roads in the Negev area. This is the date of the many unprovenance Aramaic ostraka as well as the ostraka from the Beersheba-Arad valleys, from which one can learn about the importance of the southern Shephelah and the Beersheba-Arad valleys to the Persian economy, military, and administration. Coming back to the question of why Jerusalem became the capital of Yehud in the middle of the 5th century BCE, The answer, in my opinion, should be found in the internal Judean or even Jerusalemite social, economic, political, and demographic processes which the Persians didn't prevent, although they probably were aware of the risks they were taking, and although it might be, in some aspect, against their interests. At the center of this long process was the temple, not only as a cultic and theological center, but as a center of gathering taxes and as an important fiscal center. It was a slow and gradual re-establishment of the power of the local social, religious, and fiscal classes around the temple in Jerusalem, which reached a formation and crystallization point about 2 generations after it succeeded to re-establish the city as the cultic center of Yehud. We cannot detect this process with archaeological tools, since the changes were too slow and too small. It is clear, however, that at the middle of the 5th century BCE, Jerusalem had arrived at a point of a change. If we accept the thesis that the Aramaic letters that were inserted to Ezra chapter 4 verse 7 to 24 reflect the attempt of building fortifications around Jerusalem during the reign of Artaxerxes I, still before the arrival of Nehemiah, we can interpret it as the attempt by these local power social classes to build the fortifications of Jerusalem with no connection to the Achaemenid interests and even without the agreement of the Achaemenid regime. This attempt can explain the news that reached Nehemiah by Hanani. He described as one of my brothers in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 2. This Hanani came from Judah and he said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fires. You can read it in verses 1 and 3. The news from Jerusalem stirred Nehemiah to seek permission from the king. And I'm reading from Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 5. Send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so that I can rebuild it. This can also explain the description of the wall that Nehemiah inspected. You can see it in Nehemiah chapter 2 verses 13 and 17. And the quick completion of the building project that focused on blocking the breaches that were in the wall and erecting the gates. When Nehemiah arrived as the governor of the province, he already found these local power social classes in Jerusalem. This is the first time that we have any reference to problems of such classes. Commerce relations with the Phoenicians, you can read about it in Nehemiah 13 verse 16. Economic, social, and family relations with upper classes and the leaders in the neighboring provinces, and you can read about it in Nehemiah 6 verses 17 to 19 and in Nehemiah 13 verse 4 and verses 23 to 28. Also, you can read about the problem of marriages with foreign women, and you can read about it in Ezra chapter 9 and 10 and in Nehemiah 13 verse 27. The internal social conflicts between the rich families, the nobles, and the landowners of the poor families that had to sell the lands and the houses in order to pay the debts and the heavy taxes are also reported in Nehemiah chapter 5 verses 1 to 13. The agreement of the Persians to build fortification in Jerusalem and to change the status of the city to the capital of the province was the most dramatic change in the history of the city since the Babylonian destruction in 586 BCE. The importance of this change was well understood by the compiler of the Nehemiah Memoirs and the editor of the book of Nehemiah as a beginning of a new period with high expectations and national aspirations that the city would be renewed as of old, would re-establish its physical, human, and governmental power, and would have its status restored. However, in spite of the attempt to repopulate the city, the poor archaeological remains in Jerusalem can show us that even after rebuilding the city wall. The actual demographic and architectural situation in the city didn't change dramatically, and in fact, Jerusalem didn't become a real urban center until the Hellenistic period.